I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
It was not good for me to be focused on very graphic accounts of homicide cases. So I saw opportunities for something else.
That's sociologist and human flourishing scholar Matthew T. Lee talking about the unusual journey that took him from a career in criminology to director of the Flourishing Network at Harvard.
We're not really interested in exiling people. We are interested in the possibility that we can flourish together.
Today, we discuss some of the hidden forces that shape our lives and Matt's call, along with those before him, for the beloved community.
I've just been in so many groups that say, okay, that's it, we're done. And to just insist, no, we're a community. Everyone is welcome, even the ones who are trying to break it.
All coming right up.
Are you curious about the hidden side of everything? Then I have a podcast for you. I'm Stephen Dubner, host of Freakonomics Radio. Each week, we hear from some of the most fascinating scholars and thinkers as we tackle big topics like how whales became the face of environmental activism, how to succeed at failing, and whether public transportation should be free. Go ahead, listen to Freakonomics Radio wherever you get your podcasts.
Are you stuck staring at your W-2? Are tax refund worries holding you back? You probably have FOMO, the fear of messing up. The fix? Using TurboTax on Intuit Credit Karma. They find every credit and deduction to help you get every refund dollar you deserve, or your money back. It's time to overcome your fear of messing up and get your taxes done right. Start filing today in the Credit Karma app.
Introducing Home Care Plus, a new subscription service from Lowe's that helps make life easier by giving members a hand with home maintenance. Let Lowe's tackle the tasks you keep meaning to do, like electric dryer vent cleaning, replacing hard-to-reach light bulbs, and more. Subscribe to Home Care Plus for just $99 a year and consider your to-do list done. Members get more at Lowe's. Available in select zip codes only. Cancel anytime. Non-refundable fee. Product purchase required. Terms and service restrictions apply. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
I'm Lee C. Camp. This is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
My bachelor's degree is in psychology. My master's is in criminology. And I spent the first half of my career, I would say, focused primarily on murder.
That's distinguished sociologist and human flourishing scholar, Professor Matthew T. Lee.
How do we understand not just the individual decision to kill, but the context in which that decision is made? And so a sociological approach to a topic like that would consider how group differences are important. And so we're not unconcerned with the individual, but it's really the intersection between the individual's agency and the community constraints or encouragements to do acts like murder.
So from the start, Matt wanted to make sense of human behavior not as a mere individual choice, but as something that arises out of specific communal contexts, no matter how heinous any specific individual choice. But after more than a decade working to understand the sociological complexities of criminal behavior, Matt began to notice some unwelcome changes in his own life.
I think it was Nietzsche who said, when you stare into the abyss stares into you. So it was not good for me to be focused on why are people doing bad things, and in the process, having to read very graphic accounts of homicide cases. So it just felt like I didn't like who I was becoming developmentally in my life. And I saw opportunities for something else.
With a Ph.D. in sociology from the University of Delaware in hand, Matt began exploring the idea of responding to crime in ways that were not solely rooted in punishment, but that could perhaps promote a kind of communal healing. So when he was asked to teach a course on the sociology of law,
I didn't feel particularly strong in that topic, but I was one of the few criminologists, so somebody had to teach it. And so I had some freedom with the syllabus to put some things in there that I thought, well, maybe it's not by the book, but let's try it. And so I put in one day a topic which I titled, using the Tina Turner song as a reference point, Law, What's Love Got to Do with It? We did some restorative justice kind of things, and it wasn't the adversarial winner-take-all kind of approach. And the students liked it, and I liked it. So I thought, well, maybe do a week on that next time. So we did, and then it was 2 weeks. And by the time I was granted tenure and could have some more autonomy in what I was teaching, it was a large part of the course. And I just said, why don't we just rename it Sociology of Love?
Since then, Matt's career has diverged in significant ways from those early days in criminology. He currently serves as director of the Institute for Global Human Flourishing at Baylor. He's also director of the Flourishing Network at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard. And he's widely respected as one of the leading experts in his field. At the core of his philosophy is the belief that all flourishing is mutual, meaning that it's impossible for one person to truly flourish at the expense of another, or at the expense of the planet.
A lot of research on well-being, wellness, happiness, some of these constructs that have a very narrow definition, it's usually my subjective experience of how I feel life is going. So am I satisfied with my life? Am I happy about my life? Is my life meaningful? Well, I could say yes to all of those at a very high level and be doing just atrocious things in the world. So we wouldn't want to say that that's flourishing, because flourishing is not just about the individual's subjective experience, which is important. We don't cut that out. But it's also about how are you contributing to creating the conditions for flourishing for others. And so we start to see the whole person within a beloved community. That's the framing that I like, where we are not just inviting our friends and family to flourish with us, but even the opponent, even the one who's working against our flourishing.
Inviting the person working against our own flourishing into beloved community, that's a tall order for any of us, especially in our conflicted and what feels to many of us like an increasingly aggressive world.
The question is, how do we create possibilities for sharing so that we can begin to decide as a species, are we serious about shared flourishing, or is it going to be the war of all against all?
Today, my conversation with Dr. Matthew T. Lee. Welcome, Dr. Lee.
So glad to be with you, and thank you for all the dialogues that you've been hosting on such important topics.
Glad to get to connect with you. I want to begin with literally a sophomoric question. For those who hear the word sociology and they're not so sure what a sociologist does, what's a sociologist do?
Well, there's a lot of variation among sociologists and how they would answer that question. But it's really the intersection between the individual's agency and the community constraints or encouragements. So we all have worldviews, and our worldviews are shaped by a great many influences. Of course, the family, our local community, our nation, and then whether we're sort of in Western civilization broadly defined or something else, that's all going to be part of it. And that really shapes how we understand reality and relate to reality. So
what about methodology? I mean, what kind of methodology or methodologies get employed in trying to get at these kind of questions?
On the one hand, you can certainly do a lot with statistics that you can measure and find out which of those factors are most significant from a statistical standpoint in shaping how groups and individuals will behave. And so the quantitative part, and so I'm part of the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard, is really important. But there's a qualitative side as well, where you're trying to understand not for the purpose of predicting so you can control or change or intervene, but understanding the lived experience of individuals and groups for their own sake on their own terms. So you want to understand what is meaningful, even if that involves some things from an outsider's perspective that might not be strictly speaking true. But beliefs are powerful regardless of whether they correspond to empirical reality. So those are two very different ways to come at it, and I appreciate both.
Yeah. So you said that early in your career, you spent much of your time looking at murder.
Yeah.
So what were some of the kind of questions that you're asking in this regard?
So one of the key questions that we had at the time was, is it true that immigration as a social process or immigrants as groups of people increase crime? And Just very briefly, there was a pretty dominant perspective within criminology called the social disorganization perspective. And that would suggest that as neighborhoods are disrupted by any kind of turnover, it could be immigrants from outside the United States or other kinds of internal processes, that's going to weaken the community's ability to engage in social control, and then crime will go up. And we saw some anomalies with regard to immigration, where immigration as a social process and immigrants as a group of people were, in both cases, not having that effect. And in some cases, we would see lower crime rates. And other demographers who don't focus on crime have seen this with regard to economic outcomes or health outcomes. So what's going on there? Strong sense of community, strong purpose for moving to the country to build a better life. And so strong family ties, strong religious ties, strong ties to the labor market. So when you start to look at it, it is possible that sometimes these processes create disorganization and sometimes they create revitalization. And so one of the things that we did is to study that empirically in a number of cities. And we found very little evidence that the social disorganization perspective could explain adequately the patterns that we were seeing within neighborhoods.
So how do you narrate that fact of our apparent inability as a society to hold empirical claims that may be contrary to fear-mongering, say?
Oh, it's very easy. There are vested interests behind that. So there's a lot of money to be made or political power to be seized by framing things in ways that create fear. Fear enables leaders to manipulate masses. I think that we have been overall conditioned now to believe that there's sort of bad intentions within every group. And I think that's very dangerous, especially as we get into AI generating very realistic looking images of people doing things that they didn't do. How do we recover that sense of goodwill that would enable us to care enough about empirical reality to really want to understand it?
You spend a number of years studying criminology, murder, these sorts of questions, and then you seem to take a significant sort of pivot, I guess, from that to maybe sociology of love or
That's right.
sociology of human flourishing. How did that pivot occur?
Well, we've only got an hour, so I'll be brief. When I started as a professor in the fall of 2000, I was given a course on the sociology of law to teach. And we did some restorative justice kind of things, and it wasn't the adversarial winner-take-all kind of approach. And we did that for a while, but it's fun to read and talk, but what if we actually practiced it? So we kind of flipped the classroom and called it Love in Action, and most of it was out in the world trying to experiment with random acts of kindness for strangers versus relatives. And what do you learn from that? Oh, what we learn is that the relatives are very suspicious. What do you want from me? There's got to be an ulterior motive. And then the strangers are just happy to receive. So the students would come back and there was a lot of wisdom. And so that shifted me, I think, in ways that I wasn't fully aware of at the time. But looking back, I now see it from education as a monologue, where I have the content and as a student, you receive it, to dialogue, where I really felt like I was learning more from the students than perhaps they were getting from me, but they were learning from each other as well. So we created a container in which you could have these experiments and relate it back to sociology. But really, that class could have worked in other departments as well. So I started to stray from my discipline, and that's why I like to have this title, Professor of the Social Sciences and Humanities, instead of Professor of Sociology, because I've come to see dialogue as really important to the education of students and the education of faculty, but also the mutual enrichment of disciplines.
Begin to unpack that for us of why social science and humanities has been important to you.
Well, we have a lot of research now on human flourishing, and a topic like human flourishing cannot be reduced to numbers that you can crunch with computers. Of course, there's a vantage point on flourishing there, but you need theology and philosophy and history and the other humanities disciplines. You even need the creative arts. A good novel can tell us a lot about flourishing. A good history of the beloved communities within the civil rights movement can tell us what was it like to really invite the opponent to flourish with you while the opponent is putting you in jail, et cetera. So I think that it invites a kind of generous sharing where we can become curious about something that I wasn't trained in. I was reading a lot of philosophy and theology and related topics, but I never had any formal training in that. So I needed colleagues who had a PhD in one of those disciplines to help me understand. I knew just enough to be dangerous, as they say. And so we are able to understand something like flourishing, which has so many different definitions and ways of framing it from within a vantage point of dialogue across disciplines, and even with colleagues who are not in academic disciplines, but are already doing something incredible in the business world, for example, or in the nonprofit sector or in government. So we start to take this approach to dialogue that is inclusive of other sectors beyond the academy.
I mean, that reminds me, reading years ago, an essay by Peter Drucker, the famous management guru. And as I recollect, he was bemoaning the way in which the discipline of management had failed its practitioners. He said quite pointedly that one of the reasons business schools had failed those who studied management was because they refused to ask the question, why? And that when you refuse to ask that question, then you can just do whatever it is that you're doing more efficiently that may be useless or may be purposeless or maybe even destructive.
Yes.
But I hear you saying a very similar sort of thing here.
Yes. Well, now I like that we've shifted into true dialogue because you're not interrogating me and picking my brain, but you've shared something that's really central to what I've experienced with a lot of groups across sectors, but certainly in the business community. There's a CEO named Bob Chapman who's co-authored a book called Everybody Matters. And he says what we're suffering from is leadership malpractice. And so if we care about the whole person and not just the person as productive robot, because AI will come and replace us, we can begin to ask a broader question. What is the North Star here? If it's just the extraction of labor and resources for profit, then it's hard to get too inspired by that. And in fact, Gallup has done surveys around the world where they routinely find maybe 2 out of 10 workers are engaged in the sense that they're passionate about what they're doing, they know that they're cared about, and that they can use their strengths. But in some of our research, we find that there's really 4 broad meanings of work. One is a job. It's a useful good. It's an extrinsic motivation. I'm doing it because I get a paycheck. Well, in our work, that doesn't lead to flourishing, not surprisingly. But even career is not associated empirically with flourishing. So career, you've got the extrinsic motivation, but also the intrinsic motivation. You have not just a useful good, but a pleasant good, the self-esteem that comes from being a better sociologist or something like that. But that's ultimately not fulfilling. And so there are 2 other meanings that work can have. One is a moral calling and the other is a sacred calling. And those are the 2 that we find empirically associated with flourishing. So if I'm managing an organization for scarcity and I'm leading an organization that's enormously profitable, and we give back 1% of our profit to support local communities, and it's millions of dollars, and we make a product that people like to use, but 8 out of 10 are not engaged and not flourishing, and maybe 20% are actively miserable and trying to sabotage what we're doing. It's hard to call that a success, but we've called that a success for a long time. And we've created a world where human beings are finding need substitutes because the basic needs are going unmet. And the question is that happening everywhere? Well, yeah, but it's not all the time. There are groups And we could refer to these as ecosystems of sacred hospitality. Even within any economic, political system, any kind of organization, you'll always find a group that really seems to care about each other, that has figured out how to use their gifts and their deep strengths, and they're contributing to a purpose that they believe in. You can find that everywhere. And so that's the good news. The bad news is it's pretty rare. So we've got work to do. But it is this question of why. Why are we doing this? And so from the work that we're doing now, we're trying to say, what is the deeper purpose? And then how does that help to shape the relational field that we've created in terms of how we interact? So if we have a shallow purpose, then we're going to have fairly instrumental relationships. If we have a deep purpose, then we're going to have loving relationships. And then what we're manifesting, the outputs there, are going to be more aligned with creating a world in which all people can flourish.
You're listening to No Small Endeavor and our conversation with Matthew Lee. We're grateful for the support and invitation of the Institute for Faith and Learning at Baylor, which helped make this episode possible. I love hearing from you. Tell us what you're reading, who you're paying attention to, or send us feedback about today's episode. You can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. You can get show notes for this episode in your podcast app or wherever you listen. These notes include links to resources mentioned in the episode and a full transcript. We'd be delighted if you'd tell your friends about No Small Endeavor and invite them to join us on the podcast. It helps extend the reach of the beauty, truth, and goodness we are seeking to sow in the world. Also, if you've not yet done so, we hope you'll go over to our website at nosmallendeavor.com and sign up for our free weekly newsletter in which I riff on themes related to the podcast. Coming up, Matt and I discuss what high-income countries may be getting wrong about the real meaning of human flourishing and a concept he calls beloved community. Hey friends, one of the things we've learned from listeners is that many of you don't want to just listen to these conversations. You'd like to go deeper than that. That's part of why we created NSC Plus, which is our subscriber community, where we share additional conversations, reflections, and bonus material connected to the themes of the show, especially looking for ways that this can relate to the practice of your own life. Recently, we started a new series called Reflections on a Good Life, in which I share brief reflections arising from some of our favorite NSC interviews. You might think of it as a weekly 7-minute episode in which I pull out some pearl of wisdom from an interview and suggest a question on which you might choose to meditate to further cultivate some goodness in your own life. We've also launched a new bonus series called Books You Should Know. In the first installment, I sat down with Dr. Lee Warren for a conversation that quickly became one of my favorite interviews I've done in quite a while. It's all waiting for you over at NSC Plus. And just as importantly, NSC Plus is what helps keep No Small Endeavor on the air and available for free to everyone. Subscriptions start at just $5 a month, and if these conversations have been meaningful to you, we would truly love to have you join us. You can learn more at nosmallendeavor.com or click the link in the show notes and join NSC Plus.
Start your day with Quaker Protein Instant Oatmeal. The instant oatmeal ready to help you tackle whatever your day brings, like wrangling your toddler into their car seat. That was fun. Coaching your 6th graders soccer team. Go girls! And carrying all the groceries in one trip. Whew. Try Quaker Protein Instant Oatmeal, granola, and bars. Great taste and a good source of protein. Quaker, bring out the good.
The world moves fast. Your workday, even faster. Pitching products, drafting reports, analyzing data. Microsoft 365 Copilot is your AI assistant for work. Built into Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and other Microsoft 365 apps you use. Helping you quickly write, analyze, create, and summarize. So you can cut through clutter and clear a path to your best work. Learn more at Microsoft.com/M365 Copilot.
Let's talk now then about, as you've asked interdisciplinary kinds of questions, help us think about maybe some of the arguments or what you would now say are insufficient definitions of human flourishing and the sort of broader or fuller, maybe, definitions of flourishing that you're beginning to work with?
Flourishing is not just about the individual's subjective experience, which is important. We don't cut that out. But it's also about how are you contributing to creating the conditions for flourishing for others. So the metaphor is not the isolated flower in the pot, as beautiful as that might be, but the forest, where under the ground the roots are sharing resources, where our sense of flourishing is enhanced when we see that we're flourishing with others and creating the conditions for others to flourish. And so we start to see the whole person within a beloved community. And then that beloved community is connected to other communities. And we can start to see an ecosystem emerging. And that ecosystem, of course, includes the natural world, but also the social and political and economic world, and also a sacred ecosystem. And so then people will say, well, that's too big. You can't study that. And we say, well, that's why it's transdisciplinary. So you've got environmental destruction, you've got economic calamity, you've got political decline, you have all of this polarization. What's behind all of that? Well, to some extent, this willingness to look at a part without looking at the whole. And flourishing is encouraging us to pay attention to the parts as they relate to the whole and as they relate to all the other parts. And that's not comfortable for people who have carved it up because they feel maybe implicitly attacked when we say things like this.
Yeah.
Oh, well, my research has no value. No, your research in dialogue has great value. Your research in monologue is probably the problem.
So what all are you learning about the escalation of the material abundance that, say, Western civilizations are experiencing with regard to flourishing? So
in the Global Flourishing Study, we have a composite measure called the Secure Flourishing Index, and that asks people about their happiness and life satisfaction, meaning and purpose, their sense of their own character and virtue, their sense of their quality of their close social relationships, emotional and physical health, and those are the kind of ends in themselves. And then there's a sixth domain, which is financial material stability, which is understood as an enabling domain. So if you're starving to death, your physical health is not great. But these other things are pursued as ends in themselves, and they're nearly universally valued. When you ask people around the world, and we've got 22 countries, geographically, culturally diverse, community, nationally representative samples, when you ask people how they're doing on this metric, it's not the high-income countries that come out at the top. It's the middle income. Now, we don't have the truly low-income countries because Gallup, the polling firm, didn't have the infrastructure in those countries to really pull together a representative sample. But, working within constraints, we find that it's the middle-income countries that have prioritized some of our predictor variables like religious service attendance, showing love and care, various kinds of belonging, social support that have the higher self-reported individual flourishing scores. And the higher income countries are not at the top of that list. And so the other thing that we're noticing is that young people in the high income countries are sort of doing the worst of any age group, but not in every country, just in the high income countries. So there's something that young people are telling us about how they are rejecting the conditions that we have created for them. So the takeaway there, it's not more stuff. And it's not working in an organization whose goal is greater market share and more stuff. It's the kinds of deep relationships that human beings form with each other, with their sense of their emerging, becoming self, and with the natural world and the sacred world as well.
So when you say middle income countries, what would be examples of that?
We have countries like Brazil, Indonesia, India, Philippines that are not at the bottom of the income list, but aspiring to be in the higher income bracket. And the question is, how do you preserve what is contributing to your individual subjective experience of flourishing while you pursue greater and greater economic development? I guess the other way I would say it is that every country in our list, as we've looked into not just what we're measuring, but what other people are measuring, every country has strengths and weaknesses. Some countries score really well on Yale's Environmental Performance Index, and other countries score well on the Human Freedom Index or the Global Peace Index. But most countries do not score at the top of all of those things. So is there an opportunity for us to create a space of dialogue among the human species to try to figure out how do we better harmonize and integrate across these different domains that people care about? So yes, it's great to have a sense of meaning and purpose and feel like you're a good person and all the rest, but wouldn't it be nice if we were also objectively contributing to global peace?
You've mentioned the beloved community several times. Tell us more about what has captured you about that construct.
Well, Martin Luther King Jr. said a couple of really brilliant things, and I know he was influenced by Howard Thurman and just a number of people. So this is perennial wisdom in a sense. But one thing he said is that power without love is reckless and abusive. But power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. So there's a kind of ontological unity there between power, love, and justice. There's a relationship. Love is in relation with these other things. And to look at love separately, you get what he called kind of sentimental, anemic love that is powerless. But you don't want reckless and abusive power. So the only way forward is to combine those. So in the beloved community, that's your aim. And another phrase that I love from King is that he says that love in action is insistence on community even when one tries to break it. So I've just been in so many groups that say, okay, that's it, we're done. This community didn't work, on to the next one. And to just insist, no, we're a community and everyone is welcome, even the ones who are trying to break it. Because maybe tomorrow I'll be the one that tries to break it. And that's where you need forgiveness and restorative processes. And so I got involved in some restorative justice work years ago and just was really inspired by people who had been victimized in some way in a criminal act, coming together with the person who victimized them to try to make things as right as possible. I can't turn back the clock, but what can I do to find a greater sense of wholeness? And I think, as the offender, you need to help me because you did something to cause this. And so you have a responsibility. And so there's a whole collection of practices around that. And so in a beloved community, you would say that we're not really interested in exiling people. We're not interested in it's over forever. We are interested in the possibility that we can flourish together. And if we demonstrate a deep-rooted love, then perhaps that can help people who are not practicing that get curious about that. And so whether you call that beloved community or community of love or any number of labels that people have put on that over the years, it's really the hope that if you practice a genuine love and people feel that that's what's happening, there is a genuine concern for the other for their sake, even if the other is causing harm to the community, even if the other is causing harm to me individually. But there's a genuine concern that that's an incredibly powerful force. And there's a lot of religious teachings on that topic. Religion at its best is connecting people with that ultimate power.
Coming up is a short break, followed by our discussion on the importance of dialogue and how we can learn to build our own communities of practice. Hey friends, Lee Camp here. We all need advice, but it's not always clear who to ask, even in 2026, which is why I recommend checking out How To, the long-standing advice show and 2026 AMBI Award-nominated Best Personal Growth Podcast. No Small Endeavor was also just up for the very same award in that category. So you know How To must be a great companion to our show. More than that, How To is back with new episodes and a new host with award-winning journalist Mike Pesca. Each week, Mike tackles a listener question ranging from travel to finance to relationships and beyond, with help from world-class experts who actually know what they are talking about. Think of it as eavesdropping on someone else's therapy session without a copay or awkward silence. No questions too big or too specific, like how to protect the elderly from scammers, or how to give to a good cause and make it count, and even how to make a how-to podcast. You've got questions, they will find some answers. So follow How To with Mike Pesca on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This episode is brought to you by Redfin. You're listening to a podcast, which means you're probably multitasking. Maybe even scrolling home listings on Redfin, saving homes without expecting to get them. But Redfin isn't just built for endless browsing. It's built to help you find and own a home. With agents who close twice as many deals, when you find the one, you've got a real shot at getting it. Get started at redfin.com. Own the dream.
Zootopia 2 has come home to Disney+.
Let's go!
Get ready for a new case.
We're the greatest partners of all time!
New friends.
Gary the Snake.
And your last name?
The Snake.
Dream Team. And new habitats.
Zootopia has a secret reptile population.
You can watch the record-breaking phenomenon at home. Zootopia 2, now available on Disney+, rated PG. And right now you can get Disney Plus and Hulu for just $4.99 a month for 3 months with a special limited time offer. Ends March 24th. After 3 months, plan auto renews at $12.99 a month. Terms apply.
We began talking about your earlier work and asking a question about crime, about murder, immigration, and your empirical research showing, oh no, what a lot of people are presuming is in fact false, and having to deal with this inability for our society to grapple with what appears to be empirical reality and instead being pushed and manipulated by fear. So I kind of was in my mind thinking, okay, and I even said, that's a big pivot into what you've done. But in some ways, there's a parallel, because it seems that what you're arguing and what your research is showing in this interdisciplinary work is that what we have presumed by and large is not in fact true.
Yes.
And that here you are yet again in this difficult place of giving your life's work to something that most people just simply don't buy.
We're trapped in our monologues.
Yeah.
And so part of the difficulty is just inviting people to get curious about what someone else is sharing. So inviting the United States to get curious about Indonesia. Of course, we're number one, highest GDP and all of the stuff. Well, what is it that we are suffering with right now, suffering from and with, and how can we learn through dialogue with others about how they've addressed that, perhaps more successfully? So there's just so many opportunities for us to open up to something that we foreclosed because it felt safe to foreclose it. I have just often seen people become more fully alive by engaging with something surprising that they had a trained incapacity to see. And then when somehow it's revealed, they say, oh, yes, okay, there's something there that I have ignored for most of my life because I've been trained to look at it in a different way. But now we're starting to open that up through dialogue. I remember I was in 7th grade and I liked learning about the different subjects to some extent, but I wasn't fully alive in school. And I remember sitting in a music class, and that day we weren't playing instruments. We were sitting at our desk. There's maybe 50 people, and people were singing, and I can't sing. You know, I have a terrible voice. And so I felt sad about that because I really appreciate good singing, and I know just how bad I am. But I just started crying uncontrollably in this class, and I didn't know why. And so people stopped singing, and they're like, what's wrong with Matt? Like, pat me on the shoulder. I'm like, I don't know. So, something is wrong and I can't name it. Years later, I would say that I was not developing as a whole person. I was not developing in a beloved community, and I was not developing in thriving ecosystems. I was gaining kind of cognitive knowledge But in some ways, I was moving further and further away from my possibilities. And that was a long journey to rediscover possibilities and to connect with something more deeply. So I still don't, to this day, I don't know why I cried in that moment. I didn't do it again. But I think I was sensing something that is the primary experience of the vast majority of the world's population, which is that we are not developing our best possible selves. We're not relating within beloved communities, and we're not contributing to thriving ecosystems across all these different types. And so we have an opportunity to explore that, but only through dialogue. It can't be hearing from experts.
So when you think about your own life trajectory and getting to where you are and asking these kinds of questions and wanting to explore both for yourself individually and in your work to make new possibilities for others to live most fully alive. What was it about childhood Matt, maybe, that has set you on this life course?
Don't make me cry. I don't know. I had the comparative sociologist in me was born early. We lived in Texas. I went to a Southern Baptist preschool. Then we moved to Ohio the next year. I went to a Pentecostal kindergarten, and then went into the public school the next year after that and went to a Methodist church. So those are all very different approaches. And I remember seeing beauty in each of them and seeing some problems in each of them. And I just remember being in kindergarten, we were ushered into this large auditorium, and there was an evangelist talking about salvation and whatnot. And he was going on and on about how Jesus loved everybody, which I thought, oh, that's nice. I like that. But then the twist is, but he will say to you, depart. And I've never forgotten the word depart. Like it's tattooed on my soul, in my heart. And I just thought, as a 5-year-old, I can't make sense of this. So it's unconditional love, but unless I fulfill the condition, it is depart. And so I've just been, for whatever reason, I've been in a lot of different groups that frame things in a radically different way from each other. And many of them say it's our way or the highway. And I've just have experienced over the course of my life too many examples of that, and they can't all be right. And so I started to ask the question, what does it mean if they're all partly right and partly wrong? And again, I think there's an opportunity for dialogue for us to help understand each other and learn from each other what we're getting right and where we might have some blind spots.
It's interesting, too, that you recounted there a very young childhood theological experience.
Yeah.
And then you've also recounted a different kind of theological posture with a phrase that you've used 3 or 4 times, that is living fully alive. One of my favorite lines from the early church fathers is from Irenaeus, who says that the glory of God is a human being fully alive.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's a different kind of theological vision than a finger wagging, if you don't do this right, then depart from me, right?
Right.
And so that's just fascinating to hear you that naturally kind of come out in what you've been describing.
That's very well put. What comes to mind for me is Orland Bishop has a book called The Seventh Shrine, and I remember a line from this book. I've had one conversation with him, but I know he's a kind of spiritual mentor to a great many people across great many traditions. And he dropped out of medical school to care for someone who was dying of AIDS. And this person, right before he died, said to Orland, if you go back to medical school, you won't become what you were meant to be. And he didn't go back. And so when this person died, he had this sort of realization that I don't want more. And many of us have been conditioned to want more, but I don't want more. I don't want more of anything but what is fully alive in me, and to share that with others who want to live. And so I think when I've encountered spaces, we can call them beloved community, or we can call them spaces of dialogue, where everyone is invited to contribute their best gifts, where everyone has infinite value, everyone has inherent dignity, then you see this natural emergence of holistic flourishing. It's quite inspiring, and you do feel fully alive. And then you say, wow, did 3 hours go by? That's incredible. I thought it was like 10 minutes. And so you start to compare that and contrast that with other kinds of hierarchically ordered systems where you're not invited at all. And somebody wants your time and your attention and your labor, but you're not actually invited as a person. You're invited as a cog in a machine. And so another phrase that has stuck with me since I read it back in 2015 in an article about an epidemic of suicide in Silicon Valley in the Atlantic, I think it was Palo Alto, very well-resourced. These are academic overachievers, all of the opportunities in the world at their feet. And the representative to the school board said, this is collective insanity. We feel like lifeless bodies in a system.
Wow.
I get chills every time I say that. Lifeless bodies in a system. Yes, that is a good descriptor of how 8 out of 10 people experience work around the world. And it's no wonder that Gallup finds what they call the school cliff. When you look at the engagement levels in elementary school, it's almost 8 out of 10. And then you go to middle school, when I started crying, and it's 6 out of 10. And then by high school, it's 4 out of 10. So where does it go from there? It keeps going down. And who's the lowest? The teachers, 3 out of 10. In the words of Otto Scharmer, we're collectively creating results that nobody wants. First, we have to recognize that. And then how do we begin to change that? We need some different tools than the ones that we were trained to use. And so there has to be what Otto calls a sensing from the field, not just my own subjective experience, not some outsider, a third party or third person experience, but how do we begin to sense collectively what has gone wrong and how to make it right? And so the people that I'll name today are Harville Hendricks and Helen LaKelly Hunt, who have written for years on the importance of dialogue. And so their latest book is How to Talk with Anyone About Anything. And I remember Harville saying, we can be in relationship for 30 years and never connect. We can have countless monologues, but we never actually had a dialogue, so we never actually connected. And recently he said to me, we spend our lives seeking external resources to try to find fulfillment, but it ultimately is unsatisfying. We have to realize that we are the resource, and then we share that through dialogue, and then we're fully alive.
As we close, I can imagine someone listening and saying, yeah, I see this, I feel this, I experience this in my own life. Give us some practical, okay, where next? What next?
Yeah. So back in 2019, with a small group of educators, I mean, I was teaching a university course at Harvard and others were teaching at other universities. And I started sensing that we weren't flourishing as we were promoting flourishing. There's a category of burnout called engaged exhaustion. You really care about what you're doing, but you're kind of doing it in the wrong way. And so we started what I called a community of practice education for flourishing. And eventually people started inviting others, and maybe they weren't educators, but it turned into the Flourishing Network. And now we've got something like 600 members or something. So people want this, and they can practice it with very little coaching or guidance. You need to be invited somehow. It just sort of snowballs from there. The other example I would say is my friend Bill Pearson, who was teaching anatomy to first-year medical students, and many of them were dealing with burnout. And so he created a learning community where they could, in effect, practice virtuous friendship with each other. And it didn't cost the university any money, and it didn't take a lot of his time. And it's only because we've been conditioned not to do it that we need just a reminder or an invitation. Interestingly, Bill and I have published a chapter recently in a book called The Future of Education. The chapter is called Love as the Essence of Flourishing, Educational Experiments in the Subjunctive Mood. So moving out of the indicative mood, which is this is what it is, it's really bad, to, well, this is what it might be. Let's live as if we're in a beloved community and create these communities of practice. The most interesting thing in that chapter is a footnote where Bill notes that this group of students met outside of the brand new $70 million medical education building that had just opened. They were meeting in a pretty humble environment, a building that wasn't anything like that. And they came to describe themselves as the rebels on Yavin 4. And Yavin 4, of course, is the moon base in Star Wars from which Luke Skywalker and others launched the attack on the Death Star. And they described the medical education building as the Death Star.
My. Wow.
Maybe that's a good way to end. So we can all go to Yavin 4 anytime we want. It only takes us, we had maybe 12 people in that little community of practice, and now it's expanding. We're actually having our first in-person summit next month at Harvard.
And where can folks find out more information about that?
If you go to the Human Flourishing Program's website and just click on Flourishing Network.
Been talking to Matthew Lee, professor at Baylor University, also director of the Flourishing Network at Harvard University. Visiting here at Baylor University, compliments of the Institute for Faith and Learning. Delightful to be with you today. Thanks so much for your lovely work and wonderful conversation.
Thank you for the dialogue.
Here's one closing take on today's interview. A few things I would have loved to talk about longer if we'd had time. First, the potential scandal of dialogue itself. Matt says that maybe our different communities and traditions are not simply right or wrong in total, but all partly right and partly wrong. Our cultural moment seems to prefer monologue and mic drop moments, wants our side vindicated, wants confirmation more than conversation. Dialogue might be seen as threatening in such a world, but dialogue, real dialogue, begins with the assumption that I have something to learn from you and you have something to learn from me. Then, second, there was that striking line Matt recalls from Orland Bishop's story, who realized when he dropped out of medical school, I don't want more. I don't want more of anything but what is fully alive in me, and to share that with others who want to live. Third, I loved this metaphor of the potted plant and the forest, that our conceptions of flourishing must not be reduced to an isolated flower in a pot, but expanded to the vision of the forest where under the ground the roots are sharing resources. Then, two crucial practices toward a good life. One, Matt reminds us that flourishing is not just a matter of my own felt experience, but how we are contributing to creating the conditions for flourishing of others. That's a bracing question. Not simply, am I comfortable, but do people around me have more life because I am here? And finally, Matt speaks of experiments in the subjunctive. Yes, we academics in our geek speak, but consider it, that rather than focusing on what is, that we speak as often, maybe more often, of what might be. And then having imagined what might be, we seek to build small communities of practice, to embody, to practice what might be. Perhaps hope is rarely built first at scale. It usually begins with a few people, maybe just in one room, choosing to live as though a better way is possible. That's a small, but not so small take on today's episode. Peace to you, my friend. You've been listening to No Small Endeavor and our interview with distinguished sociologist and human flourishing scholar Matthew T. Lee on human flourishing and the power of community. We're grateful for the support and invitation of the Institute for Faith and Learning at Baylor University, which helped make this episode possible. We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, a private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.